Welcome to Coffee with the Sarlos. We are your hosts of the show, Karen and Kelly Sarlo. Whether you're struggling with grief or you just need answers, we connect you with spirit to find relief, clarity, and direction in life. We can help you move forward.
Good morning, Kelly.
Good morning.
I went back to the Harry Potter books, and I picked Petunia and Evan. Yeah.
Evan, Petunia you've used before, but it's 470 shows, so that's fine. Or 80.
Well, you know what, too? I figured I had used Petunia before, and I realized when I went through all the Harry Potter names that I would be using the female names repetitively because there are not that many female characters in Harry Potter in comparison to the number of male characters in that series. There are tons of men. Mm-hmm. So maybe what I'll have to do is move away from Harry Potter for female names. And if I have a story with two males, I'll stick with it. So Petunia's the client, and Evan is the dead person in her life. And at the beginning of the session, she asks for medium, and she says, "Can I speak to my dad?" So I've named Dad Evan. And at the very beginning, he says to me, "This is going to be a little challenging for us, Karen." Us. I said, "Why is that?" And he said, she has a perspective of who I was, and that's my fault. I made sure her whole life that she saw me a certain way, and I worked like a bugger to make sure that she did right up to my death. So to come in and to be a different aspect of myself that is truly my soul is going to be quite challenging for her to accept. Keep that in your mind as we go through this. And I said, well, I'm going to put it down. I'll just doodle it on the piece of paper first. So I write that down on my paper. And she says to me, "Oh, I know you write notes on your paper. Would you write?" And I said, "I'm going to explain what I wrote a little bit later. He wants me to say some things first." And she goes, "Oh, okay." So he says, "I want to describe myself by saying what I've learned about myself first. And that's going to be the hardest part." So I said, "Well, what did you learn when you crossed over?" He said, I wasn't the kind person she believes me to be. He said, "I manipulated her from the time she was a small child to do things in ways I wanted her to do them for me because I needed to do certain things and I didn't want to do them. So I wanted her to do them. And I didn't want her to think in her own way, how would I do this? She had to think the way I wanted her." So I said, "So you insert yourself into her thinking?" And he goes, "Yeah." He says, "And I train her right from the time she's really small to do it the way I want it." And my wife doesn't say anything because both my wife and I have the same problem. And I said, "What's the problem you're referring to?" We were both alcoholic. And I said, "Okay." So I doodled that on my page, both parents alcoholics. And I said, "Is Mom alive or dead?" And he goes, "Mom's alive." And I said, "All right," put Mom's alive on the page too. And so I'm putting all these little things, and she's just waiting for me. She knows I'm just downloading what I call the file. And I said, "Does she have brothers and sisters?" "Yes." "Does she have, more like sisters over brothers or both or whatever? What do you want to tell me?" So he goes on and he says, "Yep, she's got a couple of sisters, one brother." Okay. Those are just good, clean facts. And I said, "What else do you want to say about your personality? You had started with that." And he goes, "Yeah," he says, the biggest thing that I did to her was I manipulated her to people please me." And he said, "And to people please her mother, but more importantly, me." Because, yeah, I wanted her to please her mother so that she could do her drinking and we could drink and life could be the way we wanted it to be. But at the end of the day, if Mom was really wanting something different than me, then I used my tone of voice, I used anger, I used emotions, I used all kinds of things in order to intimidate her so that, over what my wife would do, so that she would be more afraid of me than her mother. But in reality, she's afraid of both of us. And I look across, into Zoom, and I'm seeing a woman my age. So I'm seeing a woman in her early 60s. And I think, my goodness, do you mean to say that she's still like this today? And he said, oh my God, absolutely. And I said, okay, what else do you want to tell me? He goes, start by saying that, and then I'll give you more. So I do. I start. I say to Petunia these things from her dad and interspersed with the facts. And she looks at me and she goes, I'm super confused. And I said, which I'm expecting. And she said, I'm confused because you have facts about my family that are spot on. It's 100%. She says, I can tell you that your accuracy is 100%. But this isn't my dad. And I said, how can you say that? And she goes, pardon? And I said, tell me how you can tell me that. And she goes, and she's so stuck. And she goes, oh shit. She goes, I think I understand what you're saying. All of the facts are accurate. So it's my dad, because you've got nothing wrong. But when you go to describe him as somebody who manipulated me, somebody who wanted me to think the way he thought and to make sure that I pleased my mother, but above all pleased him, she says, that's not my father. He wouldn't talk like that. And I said, did you behave that way? And she goes, what? I said, did you behave that way? And she goes, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, well, let me give you an example. So I asked Dad for examples of how Mom would ask her to do a particular thing. Then Dad would come in and he would make sure that she changed it and did it his way. And how then she was terrified of Mom. And then if she went back to doing it for Mom, she was terrified of Dad. And I said, so you lived always going back and forth in fear? And she goes, oh yeah, that's very true. And I said, oh. I said, do you understand then that what Dad is now saying to you? No. So there was a need for examples from Dad all the way throughout the entire session, constantly, to be able to prove to her the things that he was saying that were true about how they treated her. And because it's him talking, he was really trying to say the things that he did, but he had to bring what Mom did into it as well. And she would sit there and she would go, yeah, I did that. Yeah, Mom did that. And then she'd have this funky pause where she'd sit and go, huh? And she'd stumble and she'd want me to repeat it. So there were many times where we had to go back through and repeat, or we'd have to break it down to say there was a tone of voice. There was a volume changed, threat levels changed. And she went, could you give me an example of a threat level changing? And we'd have to give her the example of the threat, like where the tone of voice changed with the threat. Like, you're not going to get this, or the anger intensified in Dad's tone that would then trigger her to, oh, that's the threat level that changed. The way that he spoke. So we had to find the little nuances that Mom and Dad were both using on her to keep her in compliance. Mm-hmm. And when I said that, she goes, in compliance. I think you're going to tell me I'm a people pleaser. And I said, yeah. And she goes, okay, I disagree. She says, I don't think I was people pleasing anybody. I think it's normal to want your parents to love you.
Those are two different things.
Yeah.
It is normal to want your parents to love you. Yes, people pleasing doesn't have to be something that we engage in. It's interesting. I'm listening to this. I'm choosing to regulate my tone. I would well imagine that my high school math teachers felt about me the way I feel about the average person that we coach or channel for. Because the reason I say this specifically about math is because I had a really hard time getting it. I needed a tutor to explain it in 6 different ways. And I had a teacher in high school who couldn't. And it baffles me that teachers are allowed to become teachers if you can't explain something in 3 different ways at least. But math I use on purpose because to me, language is a math. And when we're talking about emotional intelligence, my head, I wish everyone could just open my head and see what I see. But when you're talking about if you behaved like this because this person used this type of behavior, those 2 things together equal people pleasing, or those 2 things equal their verbal abuse. And so to me, it's just simple math, right? And yet, this is really cool because your client sounds like she's working very hard. She's asking for examples. She's staying engaged. She's acknowledging what she can know and see is true. And yet she can't get to the therefore this equals, because it's like, I can't afford to believe that, right? Therefore, I can't accept the math adds up this way. And I find that fascinating because of what you just illustrated. I need to believe that mom and dad loved me, or I need to believe that this is what love is. Therefore, even though all along the way, how you're breaking down the equation does make sense to me and I can validate it, the equals part, I can't.
Very good, Kelly.
Yeah, and people will say, how come I'm blocked? And it's like, because the belief system that you're trying to challenge is going to hurt so much when you accept it, or when it clicks, however you want to word that we're just not ready for it today.
Yeah. Thank you. So Dad, Evan says to me, I have an example to fix the math. No, he doesn't say that. I added that because of your analogy right now. So I said, what is it? And he goes, I want to talk about this. And this is a core memory for her, so she's got it.
And that's another thing, is that how much do we misremember because of the amount of fear she did acknowledge that she lived in, which again, I find fascinating. I can acknowledge my level of fear, but I cannot acknowledge that would be because of mom and dad not being able to love me.
Yes. And can I acknowledge, for some people listening, the amount of fear that I lived in? I'm saying that because she makes a statement later.
Okay, so he's pulling on a core memory.
And the core memory is asking her to go get, and I can't remember exactly what the tool is, so I'm just going to say
a tool.
And she doesn't know what it is. And she's young enough and not educated with tools to know what that is. So let's just say he knows because he hasn't taken out the tools and said, this is what they are. So therefore you should know. And here, go play with these. So she has no experience with that toolkit to know what any of those things are. Good. So that's a major point. And so one day he says to her, go get me this. And he says it in a tone of voice, in a way that is laced with anger, laced with aggression, to let her know. So now he's doing it purposely.
There's an urgency.
To create an urgency, to create a stress, and to create an anxiety in her so she can't think for herself. So he's trying to interrupt her ability to think for herself. And I'm explaining this to her. And I said, so you had to go pick that up. And she finishes it and says to me, okay. She says, so I did. I went and got it and I didn't know what it was. So I took a tray and I put on the tray a whole bunch of things and I laid them all out on the tray.
Brilliant.
And she says, and I carried it to him and I brought it to him hoping, okay, hopefully if I empty the tray and I place it all out, he'll just pick it up. And that way he won't be angry with me because doesn't this look good? And isn't this neat and organized? How could I possibly upset him? I've won. I have finally figured out how to please him, how to earn his love.
Okay, I'm going to reword this and call it, she over-delivered.
Yep.
And this is what people pleasers do, right? So in the urgency, in the anxiety of, oh my God, I don't want to get it wrong. And I also sense I can't afford to get this wrong. I will over deliver in the hopes to avoid the criticism. Maybe get a little bit of praise in there. That might be nice, right? Oh, look at all of this display. And yet there's still something to attack.
And he did.
Yeah.
So he perfectly said, Kelly. So he chooses in that moment, like, I can't acknowledge, I can't give this to her. I have to still take her down. So he yells at her and says, what the hell is that? And then he just grabs whatever it is, because of course she doesn't know, but he wants to grab it quick enough. So she doesn't really see what it is. So she can't remember what it is. So that if he asks for it again, she's not going to know what it is. So let's put more fear in her, going into the future. And I can't let her win now, nor can I let her win going forward. I have to keep this process going her whole life, so that she's never able to please me and always working 10 times harder than is necessary, or she should, or she is capable of. You could list all the words to say that she shouldn't even be in this situation, and that this is all kinds of forms of abuse. And here's dad doing this to a child, knowing full well at this time, and this is what he's admitting, I knew damn well what I was doing. I knew the tone of voice. I knew. And honey, I knew that you didn't know what that was. I knew you didn't know what any of the tools were. I knew that you were trying to please me. I knew that I had an opportunity to build you up and I tore you down. I knew. And the client sitting there, when he's admitting that he knew and that he was purposely destroying her so that she would have no ability to think for herself, to want to learn for herself, to be able to initiate things in life for herself, to walk away from him, to walk away from people pleasing him. Like when he lists those things, the client looks at me, Petunia looks at me and goes, this just doesn't sound like my father. And I said, right, yeah. And
Even though that was a core memory?
And I said, and what do you think of the example? And she goes, yeah, the example's right. And then I waited. And Evan says to me, say nothing, be quiet. And oh my God, Kelly, the perfect timing of silences is something I'm really trying to master by listening to the spirit guides tell me and the dead people when to give the humans their silence, because they're in their processing. So I say nothing. And I just sit there and I take my glass of water, because I always try and have something on my desk like a glass so I look busy. I'm not just staring at them like, what are you doing? I just give them time. And she looks at me after a minute and she goes, this doesn't add up. My dad knew. And now you can finally see that she's figuring out.
My dad knew what?
That her father was manipulating her. She's finally getting it. She's finally understanding, because it is the core memory. She's sitting there going, that doesn't add up. Yeah, you can see her starting. And I said, would you do that to a child? And she goes, what? And I said, would you ask a child for something knowing that they had no idea? Say they'd never cooked or been in the kitchen. Would you ask them for a spatula? Would you ask them for a crock pot or a clay bake? And she goes, no. She says, I would tell them what it looked. Oh. And then you see her understand. Oh, I would describe it. Oh, I would. And then she starts to go through, oh, I would show them. I would go get it. I would say, this is what it looks like. This is where it is. This is the color, the shape that it would be.
You'd set them up for success.
Right? And then I said, now, do you understand that you would do that? And she goes, right. And I said, do you understand that's healthy? That's called kind. That's love. And I said, and that's healthy. And she goes, and that just makes sense. And I said, that's right. I said, that just makes sense. And that's why we're saying that dad knew. That's why he's saying, Evan is saying that he knew, because he knew it made no sense to do those things to a child. to do those things to you. And then she sits there and she goes, I understand what you're doing. You're trying to help me make sense of the things that don't make sense to me. And Dad's trying to do it now because I'm in my 60s. And she says, there's so many things I do that my coworkers look at and say to me, that doesn't make any sense. What were you thinking? And she goes, and I have to look at them and go, what? And she says, I'm always in a stunned place. And people have said those things to me that I look stunned, I act stunned. She says, I hear that word repeatedly.
Yeah, she's in freeze and flight all the time.
Yeah. And so Evan says to her, I did these things on purpose. And the woman looks at me and she goes, no, my dad loved me. And I said, do you believe that that's an act of love? And what? No. Can you see that those two things, if you go back to your math, that they don't equal each other? Although that's not how it was worded during the session. Does that make sense to you? And she goes, no. And she goes, wait a minute. She says, wait, I booked this appointment because I wanted to see a medium and I watched you on Instagram and I know you talk to dead people and I just wanted you to reach up into heaven and talk to my dad and have him tell me one more time that he loves me. I didn't want to hear that he's manipulated me. Why aren't you telling me he loves me? And I wanted to know if I did enough for him. I wanted to know because I didn't make it to his deathbed. I wasn't there that last week. I wanted to know, did I do enough? I wanted to know. And so she starts going through all of the anxieties that he's created in her whole 6 decades of life, and that she hasn't even begun to start to come out of yet. Mm-hmm. And she goes, I just wanted you to tell me. And then she starts to say what she was hoping he would say, that he's been withholding her whole life. Mm-hmm. And I said, so you finally wanted to hear that you were enough. And I said, but that is what he's trying to get to, is that he treated you this way to have you believe you weren't enough, when in fact you've already and always been more than enough. And she goes, and you can see her head fucking explode. Mm-hmm. And she goes, and I said, do you need a moment? Do you need to breathe? Do you need to just think? Yeah, she says, because this just isn't adding up. And it takes us time throughout the session. I was going to say the recession, to go back over things with her and say, if this doesn't add up to this, you don't say you love somebody when you're trying to teach them that they're never enough. And she goes, that's right. I believe that. And I said, that's what your dad did to you by doing this. Yes, he did. So therefore, like your math, therefore, mm-hmm. Can you understand that? And then finally she goes, yeah, but this is mind-blowing. Do you mean to say that when you die, you actually figure this out? And I said, you have to. There's no other options. Mm-hmm. There's no diversions. There's no go garden.
There's no drinking.
Exactly. There's no defense mechanisms. There's no ego to stop you. There's nothing to block you from being able to accept who you were. And she goes, well, that I believe. And I said, really? Go ahead.
She referred to heaven, so I would imagine she does not believe that.
Right. And I said, do you not believe? I said, you mentioned heaven. I said, so do you not believe in the heaven and the hell? Yes. And I said,
then you believe there's options.
Right.
That's not the same.
Right.
One is a lack of forgiveness for eternity.
Right. And if there's a lack of forgiveness and a constant suffering, then nobody's actually helping you get to a better place. Right. And when I said that about hell, she went, oh my God. Oh my God.
Right.
She goes, oh shit. She goes, so subconsciously, I believe my dad's in hell.
Interesting.
Right?
Because she couldn't afford to believe that he did any wrong.
Yeah.
So that also doesn't add up.
And that's the whole point.
Yeah. Is that nothing makes sense because I can't see the truth?
Yes. And I said that to her. I said, look, I said, it's fair that you don't ever have healthy thinking because you've never been taught to. Every time that inner child in you had an intuition for healthy thinking, an inner knowing for it, your father made sure that you weren't able to access it. You could not.
It's the same. I'll just use a dumb example. It's the same as if 2 + 2 = 4. No doubt about it. But if your dad has been telling you your whole life that 2 + 2 = 5, and someone's sitting in front of you going, no, honey, it's 4.
Because that's the truth.
And they're like, well, I can see the 2 and I can see the 2. And if I look at it as a whole, well, no, it's 5 because I've been told it's 5. Like, that's the logic that we have to accept when we can't afford in our emotions to believe that our parents don't truly love us or have the capacity to love us.
Yes, and I like how you said that because you said it's in the emotions. So then her dad says, look, I messed up your emotions. I purposely went at your emotional state to control your mental state. And she looks at me and goes, say that again. And I said, he says that he messed up your emotional state to control your mental state.
Yeah.
And she goes, wait a minute. That's the only sentence that you've said so far that makes some sense to me.
That's shocking because that's an intellectual statement.
Yes. And I said, how come? And she goes, well, she says, because somehow it sits in my head, in my brain, that makes sense because I've never heard it before.
Neat.
And I said, okay. And she goes, and I think I can believe it because I've listened to so many of your reels and podcasts that I trust that you tell the truth. And she says, so I think I'm finally able to hold somebody else up to my dad that I believe tells me the truth. And I went, oh, this is interesting. And she goes, so if I put you up on that same pedestal as I put my father, and now you're telling me something that can make sense to me, then maybe there's a crack that my dad lied because I believe you have integrity. And I went, oh, so if you believe that another person has some level of integrity, that can put the crack in what your dad has said. It can get you to question it. And she went, yeah, I think that's what's happening to me. And I said, okay. So she goes, I need a minute to think about what you've just said, because this whole idea then that if my dad is in a heaven and I believe that heaven is just full of just forgiveness, then I'm also believing that my dad has never had to work on anything because he's just being forgiven for everything.
Then why would you even have a splitting between a heaven and a hell?
Oh, yeah, but that's also the confuckery of why someone would create a system like that and teach it, because it fucks with your logic, right?
Yeah.
And then once which is Dad's point. This is Evan's point. If I can purposely mess with her logic, with her ability to rationally think, if I can interfere with that process and rewire it, then I get to control her. So I said that to her, and she sits and she goes, this is a lot. This is a lot to think about. She goes, and she wasn't laughing. She wasn't laughing at all. She said, this is really hard because, and she goes right back to, I just wanted to hear that I did enough. I just wanted to, and then she hears herself and she goes, just a minute. She goes, I can hear myself repeating what I want. I can hear myself repeating that I literally would pay anything on earth to hear my father, no matter what you charge. I would pay anything to hear that I did enough.
That's the desperation he created.
That's right. And I said, right. I said, imagine if I was charging $10,000 for a half hour. She says, I would have fucking paid for it. She said, because I'm desperate to hear that since my dad has died, she says that I've done enough and that I'm enough finally. And I said, oh, and so if you finally hear it from dead dad that you're enough, would it be the first time in your life that you actually hear it? And she goes, yes.
Which is interesting because to hear it is one thing. And she might sit there for maybe a minute and be like, oh my God, oh my God. And I guarantee you it would be disappearing from her system in less than a minute because she's never actually known how to let that sit in her body because it's never been a truth from him.
And at this point, Kelly, to your point, she says to me, oh my God, I forgot to record this session. Oh my God, I needed to have this recorded so that I could play this again and again and again. To your point, that she already knew that she would need to hear this repeatedly because it would be something she could not believe.
That's too bad.
Right? And I said to her, okay, can we sit down and talk about how badly you needed to hear that and why you really did, what was really underneath that? That whole point of telling a child to go get a tool, knowing full well that they don't know what they're doing, so that you can control their emotions, so that you can control what they believe in their mental state. And she goes, right, I have to keep going back to the fact that my dad was always manipulating me. And I went, correct. She goes, well, then that's the answer. He didn't love me. That is the answer. And she goes, but I'm just here to hear that he does. So can you just tell me?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to say, to really say this with so much respect for her, so much respect for this person who is that vulnerable, knowing that we're moving through and we're figuring some things out together, and that you're going to feel your shame, you're going to feel all your feels, but that she's still so desperate for that in her 60s that I still need to hear that. And that I'm willing to sit in all my shame and beg for it. Beg. And I said to her, like, do you understand that he's responding that he didn't know how to? And do you understand what that means if someone doesn't know how to do something? Then how can they do it for you if they don't know how to? And she goes, oh, this is this whole thing again about messing with my mind. That I can want something that makes no sense. Or and how people find me so difficult. And I said, yeah. And she says, because I'm difficult in my own mind. And I said, well, you could certainly feel that way. I said, or and now you can go to therapy now. And she goes, okay, can we move forward then? She says, I want to know how I'm going to go forward. And I said, okay, in what regard? And she looks at me and she goes, I don't know. I don't know. And I said, can I tell you that your dad's soul loves you? And she goes, oh, yes. And I said, can I say to you that your dad's soul is showing up today? And she goes, yes. And I said, and that is what you really came here for? The soul? Oh my God. She says, I'm starting to understand. She says, I came here for my dad's soul, but I was stuck in that I wanted my human father. And you've been trying to give me my dad's soul and the human father by describing that. You've been trying to give me both, and I'm focused on one. But he's not capable of giving it to me. The soul is. And now I'm understanding that the only aspect of my father that can love me is his soul. Because my human father refused to, didn't learn to, wouldn't.
There we go.
And I said, there, now you've got it. And she goes, okay. And I said, you've worked your ass off. You have worked so hard to be able to try and figure out the 2 + 2 = 4. Or that's not with the analogy I used. But I said, you've tried so hard to figure out what love is and who your father was. and then accepted that the soul is here. I said, you have really put in a hard hour. And I said, so I hope that you celebrate. And she goes, what? I can't celebrate. And I said, well, maybe you could dance. And I'm starting to think of ways to celebrate. And she goes, no, I can't celebrate anything. She goes, I've never felt safe enough a day in my whole life to celebrate anything. And I said, right, okay, baby steps. And she goes, so if you tell me to go out and dance, go out and do something to celebrate, I can't. She says, I've never felt safe. I can't let down my guard. I can't celebrate. Celebrate is to be happy. Celebrate is to be loose, to be comfortable. She says, I've never felt that. And I said, okay, then we won't celebrate. Maybe we'll just sit here and say what you've done so far. And she goes, yeah, okay. And that's how the session ended, was the agreement that she wasn't ready for that, and that smaller, more manageable baby steps were necessary.
It was a solid hour of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for listening to Coffee with the Sarlos. If you enjoyed the show today, please be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform and leave a review. New shows will air every other Saturday.